Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice is just a few months off from reaching its 3-year anniversary, but it's remained a title that I haven't gotten around to playing until now. It has always been a title that has piqued my interest though, and was one of the inspirations for starting the Psychology of Gaming series. I knew it would be a game that I'd tackle eventually, but it's one that I wanted to save until I had a firm grasp on how to make these videos because I wanted to pay it respect. It had been lauded for its depiction of psychosis, and its dedication to portraying it properly remains admirable, and like I said, I just wanted to do it right. So the world of Hellblade is deeply rooted into Nordic myth, but Senua is a newcomer to this land, and so the depictions of the lore feel right at home. It's new information to you just as much as it is to Senua. It's kind of similar to how God of War 2018 handled things. The combat is simple in design but challenging in execution as it tests your patience and reaction time in order to eliminate foes with weighted strikes of your swords. And the world itself is haunting and hypnotizing all at the same time. Its destruction is beautiful and horrifying, and Senua's perception of it twists and turns the visuals in incredible ways unique from any other game I've ever played. But most importantly, Ninja Theory, the developers behind Hellblade, made the depiction of Senua's psychosis the absolute center of the experience, and dove in head first to display symptoms and effects of this sort of mental illness in both their most passive and intense ways. It's safe to say they didn't shy away from dipping into the taboo nature of talking about mental health that has often eluded mainstream media, and it makes this game all the more praiseworthy. So today, in this episode of Psychology of Gaming, the series where we look at how psychological principles are worked into games and how games can affect us psychologically, we take a look at psychosis and how Hellblade depicts it in media in its truest form to date. Before we dive into a look at how Hellblade portrays psychosis, it's first important to establish some background knowledge on what the condition is, how it's caused, and the symptoms that are usually associated with it. Psychosis is kind of a broad term that is used to describe a set of symptoms that are associated with mental health conditions like schizophrenia. The word psychosis is an easy and efficient way to group and label the symptoms under one umbrella term so that therapists, psychologists, and other medical professional members don't have to reiterate them during each discussion. These symptoms, which I'll discuss in a minute, can come in short bursts or last for long stretches of time, usually depending on the person's mental health condition. Psychosis can be brought on for a multitude of reasons, including extreme stress, drug and alcohol abuse, and experiencing a traumatic event. It's important to remember, though, that a person experiencing psychosis doesn't necessarily have something like schizophrenia. Remember, it's more of a broad, blanket term that's used to describe a set of symptoms. The two symptoms that are most often connected to psychosis are hallucinations and delusions. Two words you may think of as interchangeable, but they remain distinct in the field of psychology. A hallucination is a sensation experienced through the five senses that doesn't actually have any stimulus in the external world causing that perception. The most common and well-known of which are auditory, and they come in the form of hearing voices in one's head. Often, a person can feel overwhelmed as they hear multiple voices talking all at once in their head with conflicting messages. Meanwhile, the person next to them, without the condition, hears nothing at all. This phenomenon of hearing voices is generally the most recognizable symptom to the general public, but hallucinations can take form in other ways as well. Tasting something when you aren't eating anything, or smelling an odor that isn't present are other more obscure examples of hallucinations. The other major type of hallucinations are visual ones, which again oftentimes are ascribed more to drug users than schizophrenia patients by the general public, but that isn't necessarily the only case in which they can occur. A person experiencing psychosis can also experience visual hallucinations in the form of seeing shapes that aren't there or perceiving colors as being brighter than they actually are. No matter which of the five senses is actually picking up on this information, the important distinction about hallucinations is that they aren't based in reality. There is no physical stimulus prompting those reactions. The other major symptom is delusions, which has to do with our mental interpretations of events and ideas rather than our perception of physical stimuli like with hallucinations. In other words, hallucinations infect our senses, while delusions infect our beliefs. Sometimes it's simple things like believing certain shapes you see in the world are actually symbols or patterns that carry some sort of deeper meaning. Other times it's more concrete, hardened beliefs about the world itself or events that have transpired. For example, a pet that may have simply just ran away may have a person with psychosis believing something as extreme as someone going around and kidnapping all the cats in the neighborhood. Even though there is no real evidence to point to, the person with psychosis can't help but to bend their perceptions of reality and create false stories out of random events. And it's important to note that they aren't being ignorant. They genuinely believe these stories that they've created in their minds. These delusional thoughts defy ration and are sometimes used as a coping mechanism so that the person can bury the memory of a traumatic event that may have happened to them. So those are the two major symptoms associated with psychosis, and they're displayed heavily throughout Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice. But before we talk about the game, I wanted to end this part of the video by mentioning a few things. The symptoms of psychosis can often be alleviated through therapy in patients who experience it outside of other mental illnesses. Others who experience psychosis as a direct result of chronic mental health conditions will most likely have to seek therapy and support throughout their lives. And more than anything else, it's important to get away from the stigma that people that are living with symptoms of psychosis, or really any mental health condition, are crazy or a threat to society. You'd be surprised how many people living with even something like schizophrenia can live somewhat normal lives, albeit with complications and off days, no doubt. There's a common misunderstanding across the general public that people living with psychosis are somehow massive threats to society when they really aren't. It's just not the case. And when you take the time to learn about these conditions, you come to realize that many of your preconceived notions about mental health are in fact incorrect or simply misguided. And in my opinion, it's due to how mental health discussions have been kept taboo for a long time. So anyway, now that we have some guiding information about what psychosis is, we can start to look at Hellblade and see how some of these things have been directly implemented into the game. Upon starting your adventure with Senua, you will notice that the very first credit is given to a mental health advisor, indicating just how important it was to the team to get this facet of the game correct. The team at Ninja Theory worked collaboratively with psychologists and actual people living with this condition to make sure their portrayal of the subject matter was handled not only professionally, but also with accuracy, and it's safe to say they succeeded. By the way, be sure to check out the link in the description below for a short documentary made by the team showing their journey to create this game with that goal in mind. It's fantastic. By taking a more critical look at the game, it's quite evident that the team wanted the connection between Senua and the player to be as seamless as possible. They recommend using headphones while playing to you before you even reach the main menu. This game utilized an ingenious audio recording idea so that sounds and voices could be experienced from all different angles if the player is wearing headphones. And because of this choice, the voices in Senua's head become the voices in your head. You walk in the same shoes. On top of that, the game doesn't use any sort of HUD features that would pull you out of the experience. They wanted to make Senua's perspective as accessible to the player as possible, and they removed anything that would jeopardize this intended experience. These were some excellent design choices that really allow Senua's mental struggles to be put on full display for everyone to see firsthand. Throughout the game, Senua deals with many auditory and visual hallucinations, as well as believing in some delusional thoughts that are negatively influencing her life. In fact, the whole lesson to be learned from this game is about accepting loss and letting go of the past. But I'm getting ahead of myself, let's start with hallucinations. The one that makes itself most obvious to the player the most quickly would be the voices that Senua is constantly hearing in her head. Some of them encourage her to push on, while others tell her she will fail and should give up. There's this constant argument in her head, and she becomes overwhelmed by them periodically throughout the game, and even when they aren't crippling her progress, they still remain ever vigilant, just chatting away. You will also notice visual hiccups in the environment, like colors becoming brighter or the appearance of things shattering, and these represent the visual hallucinations that Senua is dealing with. Sometimes it can even interfere with puzzle solving or combat, but it's totally intentional. Psychosis doesn't take a break when it's convenient for Senua, and in turn, you, the player. Senua also experiences full visions of other people, including her mother, and also her former lover Dillion, and also her former friend Druth. These characters, Druth especially, give the player a lot of background information on Senua and the nature of this world, which fits naturally into the story as they're justified through Senua's tendency to hallucinate. It doesn't break the immersion of the story because they are contextualized perfectly. As the story unfolds, we learn more and more information about Senua's backstory. She's in this Nordic land, believing that if she can reach Hela, the goddess of death, she can reclaim the soul of her lover Dillion, who was killed, and she blames herself in part for his death. Her psychosis is often referred to as the darkness. Remember, this does take place in the 8th century after all, and we learn that Senua's mother suffered from it too. Senua's most impactful delusional belief is related to her mother, and towards the end of the game, we learn that her mother's death was not of her own volition, but instead a murder by Senua's father. Senua bore witness to this tragic death, and her spiteful and hate-filled father is easily identified as her biggest abuser and probably the cause of her mental break. Witnessing something so tragic most likely broke Senua's mental state. And this journey takes a heavy toll on Senua, but her determination to push forward is what ultimately led to her acceptance of the truth, that her mother was killed and that Dillion is never coming back. And by the time the credits roll, it's clear that Senua has accepted this and is ready to move on with her life. And again, it doesn't mean that her psychosis is miraculously cured after this. It's important to note that. Instead, she's accepted her fate and her life for what it is, and with this newfound courage from the journey, she's willing to face anything that comes her way. It's a very inspirational ending to the story. On the other hand, Senua's hallucinations also factor into the gameplay design of Hellblade. For example, people with psychosis often see shapes, patterns, and colors in the world that don't actually exist. Their fragmented minds adjust the pieces of the puzzle to create new images. In Hellblade, you'll encounter a ton of these rune doors that can only be opened by finding runes hidden in the landscape. As terrible as Senua's condition is, it allows her to more easily locate these shapes and the patterns. She kinda just has a sixth sense for finding these things, and it's illustrated in the rune shapes clouding her vision as she gets close to them. And as I alluded to earlier, the voices in Senua's head serve a real gameplay purpose. They give updates on Senua's health, as well as the stamina of enemies in combat.
Give up. Quickly get up, they're coming! She's hurt! She won't make it!
They help with navigation as well, guiding Senua on where she needs to go next, which ends up being helpful to the player as well. And these smart design choices make your experience as a participant one for one with that of Senua. So in conclusion, Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice does an incredible job at telling the harsh truth of what living with psychosis is like. The developers did not shy away from exposing the symptoms in their truest form, but instead put them front and center as if to say, this is what psychosis can be like for those suffering during mental breakdowns. It really leaves a lasting impact on its players as it successfully shows off these symptoms in a way that only video games could. Truly, I don't think this portrayal of mental illness could have been done in any other medium like movies or books, because interacting with it allows for a deeper understanding to take root. This isn't a game about having fun. Yes, enjoyment can be taken from it, but more than anything, it's a story about a woman living with mental illness who keeps pushing forward no matter how bleak things get in the outside world or the one that's in her mind. It's an inspiring story, and I'd recommend playing it solely for its praiseworthy depiction of psychosis. So if you enjoyed this video and want to check out some other similar content, be sure to scan through the rest of the Psychology of Gaming playlist. If you want more info on mental illness and its portrayal in games, consider checking out Episode 5 about Batman's psychotic break in Arkham Knight, Episode 16, which is all about anxiety, depression, and Celeste, and also Episode 19, which is about Battlefield 5 and PTSD. I hope these short snippets into the field of psychology remain entertaining for you. I love making them. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.